Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Thursday night. Nearing the end of our fast, Tainus Esther. We're fasting today, Thursday, even though Purim is on Sunday. Usually the fast is the day before Purim. But the day before Purim, when it's on Sunday, is Shabbos, so we don't fast on Shabbos. So we would move it back one more day, but the day before Shabbos is Friday when we're getting ready for Shabbos, so we don't fast on Friday. So we fast today, and we're near the end of it. When this class ends, Nina and I will be able to break the fast. So looking forward to that. I'm running on fumes, but I'm excited to do this learning with you. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Lucy in Minnesota, Bill in Mid-Missouri, David in Indiana, Joe in the Inland Empire, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Mickey had a wonderful breakfast minion and Torah reading. I did make it to that. We had an early minion today, 6:15, and then I was in the color suite all day working on our movie, Guns N' Moses. Very exciting. It's coming together. Paula in Chicago. Chaim in Florida. Marjorie in Georgia. Rochelle in Modesto. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 22, Chaf Beis, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 2, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1. So it's the basic law of lost and found articles, addressing, one of the basic questions is if you find something, so we know it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to return a lost object to its owner. But sometimes that is difficult and sometimes it is impossible. So the Mishnah defines instances when somebody lost something, without an identifying mark on it, or lost it in a place where it's just going to be swept away, like by the ocean or by a river, and without an identifying mark. So at that point, the person who lost it just has no expectation that they will recover it. So any reasonable person at that point despairs of recovering it. That's the concept yeush, despair, right? It doesn't mean that you're tearing your hair out type of despair, but it means that you have in your mind given up the idea of recovering that property because it was lost in such a way. If you drop $1 on a street in Manhattan, you don't expect that somebody's going to find you and all the masses of Manhattanites and return that dollar to you. So when you realize it's gone from your pocket, you give up on it. And therefore, somebody who finds $1 on the street in Manhattan is free to keep it, because how are you going to identify the person that lost it? That's a classic case of yeush, despair. Then we went into the concept of unconscious despair. So unconscious despair means you didn't drop $1 and it flew away from you in the wind on a windy day and ended up who knows where on the street in Manhattan. It fell out of your pocket and you weren't aware when it fell out of your pocket. Now, you didn't despair because you didn't even know it fell out of your pocket. So Abaye says that unconscious despair is not despair. The person doesn't know it's missing. He has not despaired. Therefore, if we could, if the finder knew for some reason that this was a situation where the person who lost it is unaware that he lost it, then you can't keep it because according to Abaye, unconscious despair is not despair. Rava disagrees, because when this person realizes that he dropped the dollar bill out of his pocket on the street in Manhattan, then he'll despair. And so he doesn't know it yet, but as soon as he does realize it, then despair applies. And so somebody who finds $1 in that situation, whether the person who lost it knows he lost it or not, as soon as he realizes, he will have despaired. And so Rava says the finder can keep that $1 now. Now, seeking a textual proof of whether the law is like Abaye, that unconscious despair is not despair, and therefore the finder can't keep it. He has to proclaim he find it and try to find the owner who lost it. Or that the law is like Rava, who says that unconscious despair is despair, and therefore somebody who finds something that was likely lost in an incident of, unconscious despair, and so therefore the finder can keep it. We've been looking for proofs, and the series of proofs that we examined yesterday were all offered and then rejected by the Gemara because they really aren't unconscious despair. They were examples that really came down to conscious despair when we really looked at it closely, like somebody losing a coin out of a money pouch, right? It might have fallen out without his awareness. But we have this principle that people are quite familiar with their money pouch, right? In the ancient times when it was a pouch of coins, and if coins fell out of the pouch, they would very soon realize, probably sooner than when somebody found it, and therefore we don't call that unconscious despair. We would call that conscious despair, and therefore it's not a proof of whether we follow Abaye or follow Rava. Okay, so we picked this up with the Gemara offering another proof of which way the law should be on the question of, is unconscious despair equal to despair or not? We picked this up at the very bottom of 21b, and then we'll go into 22a. The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. A thief who took an item from this person and gave it to that person, and likewise a robber who took an item from this person and gave it to that person, and likewise in the case of the Jordan River or another river that took an item from this person and gave it to that person. In all these cases, that which was taken is taken, and that which was given is given. Likewise, that which the river took, it took, and that which the river gave, it gave. And the person who received the item need not return it. Right, so in all these cases, it must be, right, like in other words, if a robber takes your money, you don't really expect that you're going to recover it. If a robber gives that money to someone else, the one who received the money from the robber, he doesn't know who the robber took it from, but he can keep it, right? Because he can assume that whoever that robber took the money from despaired of recovering it back, has given up on it. That's what rendered the money ownerless. Right? It's not that the robber acquired title to it. It was really rendered ownerless. The robber is holding it if he then gave it to someone else. So in other words, if a known robber comes to you, and buys a Coke from you, you can sell him that Coca-Cola. And if he gives you a tip, you can keep the tip, even though he probably stole that money because it was rendered ownerless, right? And the person who lost it despaired of it, and therefore what the robber took is taken. That person doesn't assume he's going to get it back. He's despaired of recovering it. And what the robber gave is given. The one who received that money can keep it. Now, how does this address the question of Abaye and Rava? So the Gemara asks, granted, in the cases of the robber and the Jordan River, one could say that the owner sees them take the item and despairs of its recovery. Not unconscious despair. That's conscious despair. But in the case of the thief, who takes the item surreptitiously, does the owner see him take the item? And would that lead him to despair? Right? A thief comes in surreptitiously. So it could certainly happen that a thief came in, took something and left, and you didn't even know it was missing. So that would be unconscious despair, right? If you knew the thief took it, it would be despair, but you don't know that he took it. So why would you assume that the owner has despaired? So maybe somebody receives, something from a thief is not entitled to keep it in the same way that he would from a robber, because when a robber takes, the owner knows it was taken. When a thief takes, the owner doesn't necessarily know it was taken. The Gemara explains, Rav Papa interpreted the term thief in this Baraisa to be referring not to surreptitious thieves that come in the night, but rather to a different type of robber, namely an armed bandit, right? So the robber just, threatens you with his fist, and I guess an armed bandit threatens you with weapons, but they both strong-arm you into taking your property. So therefore, the owner is aware that the item was taken, and he despairs of its recovery. Again, conscious despair, not unconscious despair. So the Gemara asks, if so, if we're talking about armed bandits, not thieves, this is the same as a robber. Why mention two identical cases? And the Gemara answers, the Baraisa mentioned two types of robbers. In both cases, the owner was aware that his item was taken. And yeah, it's just clarifying that whether the one who took is just a regular ruffian or an organized, cartel type of armed bandit. In both cases, the one who was robbed in this way will despair of recovering the property, and somebody who ended up getting that property from these crooks, acquired ownerless property. Now, the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from a Baraisa. If a river swept away one's beams, one's wood, or one's stones, and placed them into the field of another person. So these items belong to the owner of the field, the one who, in the field of another person. So the one whose field this stuff ended up in, right? A river swept away, let's say, a pile of wood that was on one person's property, ended up depositing it on a field miles away. So where that wood ended up, the guy, acquired some wood for his field. He has no idea where it came from. It just came down river and ended up in his field. So says the Gemara, the one in whose field the wood ends up, he acquires the wood. And these items belong to the owner of the field. Why? Due to the fact that the respective owners despaired of their recovery upstream. So the Gemara infers from the Baraisa, the reason they belong to the finder is that the owners despaired. But in an unspecified case, where it is not definitively known that the owners despaired, they do not belong to the finder. So apparently, unconscious despair is not despair, like Abaye says. And the Gemara rejects the proof with, what are we dealing here? It is a case where the owners are capable of rescuing the beams, the wood, or the stones, and therefore their decision not to rescue them is a clear indication of despair. Despair meaning they gave up on it. Okay, they could have organized, all kinds of effort and helpers and a boat and who knows what, and gone after the wood, and they said, you know what, it's not worth it. I'll just let the river take it. And that's what indicates they have despaired of recovering it, meaning they rendered it ownerless, and that's why when it ends up downstream in somebody's field, the owner of the field acquires the beams, the wood, or the stones. And the Gemara asks, if so, say the latter clause of the same Baraisa, which reads, if the owners were pursuing the items, then the finder is obligated to return them, because obviously if the owner is pursuing, he has not despaired of recovering. If it is a case where the owners are capable of rescuing the items, why did the Baraisa specifically cite a case where the owners were pursuing the items? Even if they were not pursuing the lost items, the items also remain in their ownership if we're saying that the possibility of recovering them means that they have not despaired, then whether they were actually pursuing or not actually doesn't matter, because they know they have the option, therefore they have not despaired, which would imply that the finders of these articles that were swept away by the river and who find them downstream cannot keep them, cannot assume that the people upstream have despaired of recovery. So therefore these items have not been rendered ownerless and those people can't keep them. Right? They need to proclaim what they found and see if they can locate the owner. So the Gemara answers with, what are we dealing here? It is a case where the owners are capable of rescuing the items, but only with great difficulty. In that case, if the owners pursue the items, it indicates that they did not despair of their recovery. But if the owners do not pursue the items, it indicates that they have despaired, they rendered it ownerless, and finders are keepers. Come in here a proof, still on the question of Abaye, and so that was really about conscious despair. So we have not solved the problem of what about unconscious despair. So coming here a proof from a Baraisa Tosefta of Terumot 1.5. When did the sages say that in the case where one separates terumah, right, the tithe that goes to the priest from the produce, the first 2%, when one separates terumah without the owner's consent, right, the owner of the produce, his terumah is considered terumah, right? The owner of the produce, he is obligated to tithe his produce before he can consume it. First 2% to a Kohen, right, to a priest. Next 10% to a Levite. And then the next 10% after that is the second tithe, which either he consumes when he goes up to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage festival when the temple was standing, or it's given away to the poor. That's the tithing process. Who is obligated to tithe? The owner of the produce. But here we're saying, what if somebody else separates the terumah on his behalf? Has the terumah actually been separated from that produce? Is this terumah, when somebody did it, you can be the agent of the owner and separate terumah for him. That's with his knowledge. Here we're talking about somebody who separates terumah on behalf of the owner without the owner's knowledge, right? Unconscious on the part of the owner. So has that separation of the 2% actually created terumah, the tithe given to the priest? Let's see. When did the sages say that in the case of one who separates terumah without the owner's consent, that his terumah is considered terumah? It is in a case where there was someone who entered another person's field and gathered produce from it and separated terumah without the owner's permission. If he is concerned that the owner will object to his actions and view it as robbery, then his terumah is not terumah. But if he is not concerned, then his terumah is terumah. In other words, I have an orchard and I'm away on a trip. I went away. I didn't, I just didn't worry about my orchard. I went on a long trip, or maybe I got delayed. I was going to come back in time for harvesting the apples, but I didn't. I got delayed overseas. You're my neighbor, and you think to yourself, well, Sal's not picking his apples. He's always given me a basket of apples when he harvests his apples. In fact, he's given me 10 baskets of apples every year for the last 20 years. So now that he's not here harvesting, obviously he's not going to mind if I walk into his orchard, and pick one basket of apples. Certainly Sal won't mind. I know he won't mind. Now, if I do that, even though you're not the owner of the orchard, but you're harvesting a basket of apples that you're going to take, as a presumptive gift because I would have given it to you, you can't eat it unless it's tithed. So you're going to separate terumah from it on my behalf, right? That terumah is going to be given to a priest, and you're going to say, this is from Sal's orchard, and he's giving me this basket of apples, and this is the tithe that I took out of it on Sal's behalf. And here you go, Mr. Priest, take this 2% of the apples that I picked. So that was done without my knowledge, without my consent, without my explicit permission. Since you have no reason to doubt that I would do that I would agree to this, the terumah is terumah. On the other hand, if you snuck into my orchard without my awareness, because I would, because haven't been getting along for a few years, but you really need a bunch of apples because you've got a bunch of friends coming over and they're expecting apple pie, and the apples you bought at the market were mealy and full of worms, and now you have no apples and you need the apples in a big hurry. So you're going to basically just steal my apples. So you don't feel bad about taking apples from me. Maybe you'll even pay me later, but you don't want to, have a discussion about it because I might say no. So you're even planning to pay for it later, but you're doing this without my permission, and you have good reason to suspect that I wouldn't agree to it. Why are you're stealing my apples? Are you really going to be thinking about tithing also? Well, maybe yeah. Maybe you're a pious person. You just think that I'm, unreasonable and wouldn't agree to this. But you know that apples cannot be eaten unless they've been tithed. So you'll separate terumah. But since you're separating and you have reason to believe that I would not agree to that, say the sages, that terumah is not terumah. Okay, that's the principle. Now we're going to see how this applies to whether unconscious despair in the case of lost items equals despair or not, right? We're going to make that connection eventually. And from where, so that Baraisa continues, and from where would the gatherer know whether he should be concerned that the owner objects and views him taking this produce and tithing it and separating terumah from it, whether the owner would consider that robbery or not? Well, one example of the way you could assume that I am okay with it is if the owner came. I suddenly came back. I arrived. You thought I was away, but I came back. And I came and I found you separating the terumah from the produce that you took from my land. And I said to you, you should have gone to take the produce of better quality. You should take better apples. You took the mediocre apples. You should have taken the better apples and separated terumah from that. Well, then, if produce of better quality exists on my land, then you'll know that I was sincere, and therefore the terumah is terumah, since the owner is assumed to have been sincere and pleased that the other has separated terumah from his produce. But if there is no better quality, higher quality produce on my land, then you'll know that I was being sarcastic. This is the actual nuance that they're describing here. When I said, oh, you should have taken better produce to separate terumah from, but you have taken from the best produce, then you'll realize that I was speaking sarcastically, and you'll realize that I'm not happy you walked on my land, took some produce, and separated terumah from it, and then you'll realize that the terumah is not terumah. Now the Baraisa adds, if the owners were gathering and adding to the terumah that you had separated, indicating that they agree to this act of separation, then either way, whether or not better quality produce was found or not, this terumah is considered terumah because the owner has given clear and convincing demonstration that he approves of the terumah that you or the other person has separated, and therefore the terumah is terumah. Now, we're getting back to our subject. So the Gemara questions the ruling of the Baraisa. But why is that the law? That if the produce of better quality than the produce that he had separated, that the guest had separated, is found, then the terumah is terumah. At the time that he separated the terumah, he did not know that the owner would ultimately agree. So the Baraisa states that terumah is terumah from the moment he separated it. Right, the terumah he's already separated is valid terumah, despite the fact that it was only later that the trespasser learned that the owner of the land agreed to the separation of terumah. Apparently, in the case of despair as well, despair that is not conscious, meaning unconscious despair, is considered despair, which would be contrary to the opinion of Abaye, and would confirm the opinion of Rava. And Rava interpreted the matter in accordance with the opinion of Abaye, meaning this is a case where the owner designated him as an agent, right? So in other words, even though you could say that this is proof of Rava's point, Rava himself said, no, you can't bring this as a proof because here we're talking about a case where the owner knew. He appointed the neighbor. He said to him, yeah, you can come anytime. If you take apples from my orchard, just make sure you separate terumah from them. So there's nothing unconscious here. So too, it is reasonable, as if it enters your mind, that the owner did not designate him, right, the neighbor, as an agent. Would his terumah be terumah? But doesn't the merciful one state, here's the law of terumah, Numbers 18:28, so you also shall set apart a gift unto the Lord of all your tithes. So once the verse states you, right, so you also shall set apart a gift of the Lord unto all your tithes. Once the verse states you, the addition of the word also in the term you also serves to include both the person obligated to separate the tithe, the owner, and his agent. Therefore, an agent separating terumah has the same laws as an owner separating terumah. Just as when you, the owner, separate terumah, it is with your knowledge, that's why you're doing it. So too, when your agent separates terumah, it must be with your knowledge. Evidently, in any event, one needs to be appointed as an agent to be capable of separating terumah for another, and that's what would disqualify that baraisa from, coming to serve as a proof in our discussion of whether unconscious despair is despair or not. Or maybe it doesn't. Rather, with what are we dealing here? It is a case where the owner designated him as an agent and said to him, go and separate terumah. But he did not say to him, separate terumah from these specific crops. And when the owner's intent is unspecified, and it is unclear which of his crops are meant to be separated when the agent separates terumah, it is from the crops of intermediate quality that the agent should separate terumah. And in this case, the agent went and separated terumah from the higher quality produce. And the owner of the field came and found him and said to him, you should have gone to take the produce of better quality and separate terumah from that. So if produce of better quality than the produce that he actually separated from is found, then the terumah is terumah. But if not, his terumah is not terumah. And the Gemara digresses for a moment with a related incident. A Maimar, Mar Zutra, and Rav Ashi happened to come to the orchard of Mari bar Itzak. And his sharecropper, right, Mari bar Itzak's sharecropper, came and placed dates and pomegranates before these visiting sages. And Amaymar and Rav Ashi ate the fruit, but Mar Zutra did not eat the fruit due to the concern that the sharecropper had provided them with fruit without the approval of the owner of the field. Meanwhile, the owner, Mari bar Itzak, came and found them eating his fruit and said to his sharecropper, why didn't you bring the sages fruit from these higher quality fruits? So Amaymar and Rav Ashi then said to Mar Zutra, now after this statement of the owner, why is the master still not eating his fruit? But isn't it taught in a baraisa, in a case where the owner of the field came and found him and said to him, you should have gone to take the produce of better quality and separate terumah from that. If produce of better quality than the produce he had separated is found, his terumah is considered terumah. So here too, it is clear that Mari bar Itzak approved of the actions of his sharecropper when he put fruit in front of the sages, the visiting sages, for them to eat. And Mar Zutra said to them that this is what Rava said. The sages said that the statement you should have gone to take the produce of better quality and separate terumah from that indicates consent of the owner only with regard to the matter of terumah, due to the fact that it is a commandment to separate terumah, and the owner is amenable to having that mitzvah fulfilled. But here in this incident, it is due to shame that he said this. Why did you not bring the sages fruit from higher quality fruits? He did not really want to give them the fruit. We can't be sure that he wanted to give them the fruit. He's just embarrassed that now there are sages on his property eating, and he just wants to make a show of, saying, oh, you should have given them even better fruit. But we don't know for sure that that's what he meant, even when he says you should have given them higher quality fruit, because there's no obligation, there's no mitzvah obligation. I mean, there is hospitality, and there is being of use and being of service to the sages, but it's not the same kind of obligation on a landowner as tithing, because produce cannot be eaten at all, can't be sold, can't be eaten for sure, without tithing, right? So that for sure the owner would be amenable to that. This idea that his sharecropper gave away some of his food to people that he doesn't really know, but who he assumes are friends of the owner, those friends can't be sure that the owner would have given them such fruit. And that's why Mar Zutra, who is punctilious in all matters of honesty, wouldn't eat the fruit. We still haven't proven whether Abaye or Rava is right with regard to unconscious despair of a lost item. Come in here another proof from a baraisa with regard to despair that is not conscious. It is written, quote, and if any part of their carcass falls upon any sowing seed, S-O-W-I-N-G, that is to be sown, it is ritually pure. But when water is placed upon the seed and any part of their carcass falls thereon, it is ritually impure unto you. So we're talking about a sheretz, right? A sheretz is one of the species of creeping things that if it dies, right, like a mouse or certain bugs or rodents, that die, and then the carcass falls on produce, right? It's going to render that produce tamei, ritually impure. And therefore, a regular Jew could still eat it. Remember that ritual impurity is not like some kind of disease or sickness or anything like that. It's just ritual impurity. But it does mean that you couldn't use that produce, you couldn't turn it into terumah and give it to a priest, because a priest can only eat terumah when the terumah is tahor, ritually pure, and the priest is in a state of ritual purity. Right? If either the terumah is tamei or the priest himself is tamei, and that could happen, if either one of them came into contact with a sheretz, right, this dead creeping thing, the priest can become purified. He can immerse in a mikvah, wait for nightfall, and he'll become tahor again. But the terumah that comes into contact with the sheretz is rendered tamei, and now the priest cannot eat it. He could sell it, but he cannot eat it. Now, what are we talking about with this water, right? So now, dry produce, like let's say there's a pile of wheat, harvested wheat, right? It's been winnowed, whatever, and there's a pile of wheat, right? Grains of wheat there. And it's going to, and it stands to be tithed, and maybe it has been tithed, okay? But let's say it hasn't been tithed yet, and we want it to remain in a state of tahara, ritual purity, so that we can take terumah from it and give it to a priest. If the sheretz falls on it, it does not become tamei, unless it has come into contact with moisture, right? So things that are dry and have never become moist are not susceptible to this kind of ritual impurity. Only once they have come into contact with the 7 liquids are they capable of becoming tamei. And now what we're going to talk about is what kind of contact with liquid did the produce have before the sheretz fell on it? Was it contact that was either purposely done, that for whatever reason the owner of the produce made it moist, or in this case we're going to talk about that there was the morning dew on it, and he didn't try to take the dew off. He was conscious that the dew was there. In fact, it works for him. It helps preserve the grain to have a layer of dew on top of it. So that means that it is moist with his approval, and if a sheretz falls onto it, it does become tamei. Or if it was incidental contact with one of these liquids, and it was not according to his volition, the owner of the produce, then if the sheretz falls on it, it is not going to become tamei. There's very nuanced laws, but what it turns on is whether the owner of the produce was conscious of the fact and approved of the fact that his produce had become moist. And that will affect whether it becomes susceptible to tumah, to ritual impurity, or not. So I'm going to read the explanation here, which will restate that. Produce becomes susceptible to contracting ritual impurity only after coming into contact with one of the 7 liquids, which are wine, honey, oil, milk, dew, blood, and water. Now, it is taught in the Baraisa, if the dew is still upon the produce and has not yet dried, then if the owner was glad that the dew moistened the produce and kept it fresh, then that produce falls into the category of, but when water is placed upon the seed, right? Because it's with his approval. It's as if he placed the water there. And the produce is susceptible to contracting ritual impurity. If the produce had dried when the owner found it, then even though he was glad that the dew had moistened the produce is not in the category of, but when water is placed upon the seed, and the produce is not susceptible to contracting ritual impurity. We're on page 22b now. So what is the reason that if the produce dried, the fact that the owner is glad does not render it susceptible to ritual impurity? It is not due to the fact that we do not say, since the matter was revealed that he is amenable to the moisture now, he was also amenable from the outset. I'm sorry. Is it not due to the fact that we do not say, since the matter was revealed that he is amenable to the moisture now, then therefore he was also amenable from the outset? In other words, unconscious despair is despair, but we don't say that. right? The same should be true with regard to despair that is not conscious. The fact that when he becomes aware of his loss, he despairs of its recovery does not indicate that he despaired from the outset, contrary to the opinion of Rava. But the Gemara rejects the proof. It is different there, as although the phrase is vocalized to mean when it is placed, still it is written when one places, from which it is derived that the produce is rendered susceptible to ritual impurity only if the owner directly places the liquid on the produce. He was moving it further into the process of eventually consuming it. He wetted the produce on purpose, and that's what made it susceptible to impurity. But the Gemara asks, if so, in the first clause of the Baraisa too, the produce should not be rendered susceptible to contracting impurity because the dew fell on the produce and was not placed there by the owner. And the Gemara answers there, the explanation is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa, as Rav Papa raised a contradiction. The verse states, but when water is placed upon the seed and any part of a sheretz, of a dead creeping thing, carcass, falls thereon, it becomes ritually impure unto you. Leviticus 11:38. And the word yutan is written in the defective form as if it says ki yiten. Accordingly, this would mean that one must actively place the water on the produce. Yet, we read it based on the tradition as to its correct pronunciation as if it were written ki yutan, which includes any situation where the produce becomes wet. How so? How can the way the verse is written and the way that it is read be reconciled? Remember that in the Torah, there are no vowels under the letters. So certain words where the consonants are going to be the same, but the vowelization will change the syntax. It could be read one way, it could be read another way, right? And sometimes, in fact, it's written where the standard way of pronouncing that, would be like this. But we have a tradition that we don't pronounce it that way, we pronounce it this other way. So there's a difference between how it's written and how it is read. That's what's going on here. So Rav Papa explains that we require that the situation described by the words when the water is placed be similar to the situation described by the words when one places. What would be a similar situation where the active and the passive forms both apply? Just as the term places, yiten, indicates that it is with the knowledge of the owner that the produce becomes wet, as he himself is placing the water there, so too the term is placed means that it is with his knowledge that the produce becomes wet, despite the fact that he himself did not place the water there. Therefore, no proof may be cited with regard to the matter of despair, where there is no Torah derivation requiring awareness from the outset. Right? You could argue that, well, he knows that the dew is there, he's not coming to wipe it away, so that's like he placed the water there himself. Maybe so, maybe not, but we're not going to apply this principle of awareness and whether the owner of the produce having awareness of the manner in which moisture came to be part of the produce and whether that makes it susceptible to tumor or not. We're just not going to be able to apply that principle to unconscious despair in the case of lost objects. So let's try a different proof. Come and hear a proof from that, which Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael ben Yehotzadak. From where is it derived with regard to a lost item that the river swept away, that it is permitted for its finder to keep it? It is derived from this verse, as it is written, Deuteronomy 22:3. And so shall you do with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garment, and so shall you do with every lost item of your brother, which shall be lost from him, and you have found it. That's the home address of the law, that if you find lost objects that belong to your brother, meaning your brother at large, your brothers and sisters in the population that you live among, if you find something of theirs, you seek to return it, right? That's the basic law, that you don't keep things that you find, you seek to return it. And yet we know there's a limitation on that. So how does it work? The verse states that one must return that which is lost from him, the owner, but is available to be found by any person. And excluded from that obligation is that which is lost from him and is not available to be found by any person, because it is ownerless property, and of that anyone who finds it may keep it, right? Once it was swept away by the river, anybody who was thinking, oh, my stuff was swept away, oh, it's gone. Let me find it for you. Where'd you drop it? Oh, it got swept away in the river. Dude, you're out of luck. That is ownerless property, and that's why when somebody finds it downstream, they can keep it. And the prohibition written in the verse against keeping an item that is lost only to its owner, is similar to the allowance to keep an item lost to all people, and that is inferred from the verse. Just as in the case of the allowance, meaning you could keep it, whether there is a distinguishing mark and whether there is no distinguishing mark, this is the key idea. It is permitted for the finder to keep it, right? You can keep something that has no distinguishing marks on it because no one would think of recovering that. It's lost to everybody. But if there is a distinguishing mark, then it's only lost from the owner, but somebody could find it and give it to him. And that's why if you happen to be the one who finds it, you have to make sure you return it. Right, so, but let me read how it says this, because it's a little bit different than what I just said, perhaps. So it says, and the prohibition written in the verse against keeping an item that is lost only to its owner, only he doesn't know where it is, right? It could be found by anyone. This is similar to the allowance to keep an item lost to all people that is inferred from the verse. Just as in the case of the allowance to keep, whether there is a distinguishing mark and whether there is no distinguishing mark, it is permitted for the finder to keep it. So too, in the case of the prohibition, whether there is a distinguishing mark and whether there is no distinguishing mark, it is prohibited for the finder to keep it until there is proof that the owner despaired of its recovery. In other words, whether there's a distinguishing mark or not, that is not the dispositive principle. It's going to be one of the things we examine. But what is actually dispositive is whether or not the owner despaired of recovering it or not. Now, the fact that there's no distinguishing marks on it is evidence that we could use to decide, well, whoever lost this, it has no distinguishing marks on it, he must have despaired. But it's not because there's no distinguishing marks on it that he automatically despaired, because maybe he lost it in a very specific place and he's going to come back to that place looking for it. So just the fact that there's no distinguishing mark is not enough. You have to have good cause to believe that the owner has despaired of losing it. And therefore, the Gemara concludes that the refutation of the opinion of Rava, that unconscious despair is despair, has been refuted. And in fact, although in most disputes between Rava and Abaye, we follow Rava, in this one we follow Abaye. And unconscious despair is not automatically despair, meaning you can't assume that this person despaired. You have to have very good reason to believe that he despaired, right? And although in disputes between Abaye and Rava, the law is typically ruled in accordance with the opinion of Rava, this law is in accordance with the opinion of Abaye, and as it is in disputes represented by the mnemonic Yud Ayin Lamed Kuf Gimel Mem. These are 6 examples where the law follows Abaye in his dispute with Rava. Now Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, and now that the opinion of Rava has been conclusively refuted, and the law is that despair that is not conscious is not considered despair, so if those dates are blown off the tree by the wind, how do we eat them? Right? We started with our MIshna that said that dates that fell from a tree on the ground, we assume that the owner of the tree has despaired of recovering those dates, so you're free to eat them. But why? Why are we going to make that assumption of unconscious despair is not despair? He's not aware that these particular dates that fell off his tree, but that doesn't matter. We can't assume that he despaired of recovering them. So why does the MIshna say that we can eat dates that fell off his tree? Perhaps their owner did not despair of their recovery. So Rav Ashi said to him, since there are repugnant creatures and creeping animals that eat the dates after they fall, that's why the owner despairs of their recovery from the outset, and therefore one who finds the dates may keep them. It's not that we have to know whether he in fact despaired or not. It's that we don't assume automatically that he despaired of recovering them just because they fell off the tree. But when we take into account that under this tree, stuff that falls in the mud and where there's, disgusting creatures, nobody's going to want to eat that. So now the owner doesn't care about the dates that fell in there. And if you want to pick it up and wipe it off and eat it, you can. Rav Acha asked, perhaps the tree belonged to minor orphans who, because they are not legally capable of relinquishing property because they're minors, therefore they cannot despair of recovering the dates from the outset. Whether or not there's creeping things crawling around on the ground underneath them or not, it doesn't matter what their mental state is. They're not legally permitted to despair or not despair, right? Their opinion is not legally significant. So how can you assume that the tree is not owned by minors who are not capable of despairing, and therefore anything that falls is not available to be picked up? Rav Ashi said to him, we do not presume a valley to be land belonging to orphans, and therefore that is not a concern. It might be owned by orphans, but in most cases it's not. Rav Acha asked, if the presumptive status of the trees was previously established as belonging to orphans, then what is the law? If the trees are surrounded by fences that prevent repugnant creatures and creeping animals from gaining access, then what is the law? And then Rav Ashi said to him, okay, so then the dates are forbidden in those cases. Okay, good question. Then the dates are forbidden. New area, new subject. The Mishnah teaches, our Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2, the Mishnah taught that if one found bundles of grain in a public area, these belong to him. Rabbah says with regard to this ruling, and this is the law, even with regard to an item on which there is a distinguishing mark. This seems like, right, somebody dropped something in a place where it was going to be trampled, it was going to be picked up by strangers. Nobody would expect it to still be there when he came back, and that's why a finder can keep it. And the Gemara comments, apparently Rabbah holds that the legal status of distinguishing mark that is prone to be trampled is not that of a distinguishing mark. Since the owner of the lost item knows that the mark is prone to be trampled, he does not rely on it, and he despairs of recovering the item. Rava said, the sages taught this law only with regard to an item on which there is no distinguishing mark. But with regard to an item on which there is a distinguishing mark, the one who finds it is obligated to proclaim his find. And the Gemara comments, so apparently Rabbah holds that the legal status of a distinguishing mark that is prone to be trampled is nevertheless a distinguishing mark. So if there was a distinguishing mark on it, even if it was dropped in a place where you might think that the produce will be trampled and the distinguishing mark will be lost, nevertheless, since there was a distinguishing mark on the bundle of produce, its owner will think to himself when he realizes he dropped it, well, I had a distinguishing mark on it. Maybe I got lucky. It didn't get trampled. I'm going to go back and find it. So you can't assume that he despaired of losing it. Therefore, finders are not keepers. And there are those who teach this dispute, who teach the dispute with regard to this law independent of the Mishnah. Meaning, with regard to the legal status of a distinguishing mark that is prone to be trampled, Rabbah says it is not a distinguishing mark, and Rava says it is a distinguishing mark. The Gemara cites proof from that which we learned in a Baraisa. If one finds bundles of grain in a public area, these belong to him. If he finds them in a secluded area, the finder takes them and proclaims his find. What are the circumstances? If it is a case where there is no distinguishing mark on the bundles, when one finds them in a secluded area, what does he proclaim? Rather, is it not a case where there is a distinguishing mark on the bundles, and there is then a reason for him to proclaim his find? And yet, it is taught in the Baraisa that if he finds the bundles in a public area, those bundles belong to him. So apparently a distinguishing mark that is prone to be trampled is not a distinguishing mark. And this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rava. Poor Rava. Now he's had two refuted. Rava could have said to you, however, actually it is a case where there is no distinguishing mark on the bundles. And with regard to that which you said, when one finds them in a secluded area, what does he proclaim? He proclaims that the owner should provide the location where he lost the bundles and thereby recover his bundles. Right? You could pick it up and then proclaim, I found these lost bundles. The owner can come forward and claim them by telling me where he lost them. Right? And if he knows where he lost them, that would be the distinguishing mark. And Rabbah said, the location provided by the owner is not a distinguishing mark that would enable the return of an item to its owner, as it was stated that the Amoraim, right, the sages of the Gemara, disputed this matter. With regard to location, Rabba says it is not a distinguishing mark, and Rava says it is a distinguishing mark. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. If one finds bundles of grain in a public area, these belong to him. If he finds them in a secluded area, the finder takes them and proclaims his find. And with regard to the sheaves, i.e. large bundles, whether he finds them in a public area or whether he finds them in a secluded area, the finder takes them and proclaims his find. How does Rabba explain the Baraisa, and how does Rava explain the Baraisa? Rabba explains according to his line of reasoning that the Baraisa is referring to bundles with a distinguishing mark. And Rava explains according to his line of reasoning that the Baraisa is referring to bundles whose location is their distinguishing mark. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Gemara elaborates that Rabba explains according to his line of reasoning that the Baraisa is referring to bundles with a distinguishing mark. If one finds bundles of grain in a public area, these belong to him due to the fact that they are trampled. Even if there had been a distinguishing mark on the bundles, it would have been destroyed when it was trampled. If he finds them in a secluded area, the finder takes the sheaves and proclaims his find as, due to the absence of pedestrian traffic, they are not trampled, and the distinguishing mark remains intact. And with regard to the sheaves, whether he finds them in a public area or whether he finds them in a secluded area, the finder takes them and proclaims his find. Since they protrude high above the ground, they are not trampled, right? A bundle, just imagine like a bundle of radishes, like 10 radishes in a bundle, right? Maybe you had a distinguishing mark on them, but if you drop them on the street where people are walking, that bundle of radishes is not likely something somebody's going to return for. It was trampled. The distinguishing mark is probably trampled. It's not what you come back for. But a sheaf of radishes would be like a big bundle. Like, in other words, 10 bundles, 100 radishes, much bigger, more significant item, less likely to be trampled, and much more likely that the owner did not despair and will be coming back for it. And that's why the finder has to proclaim that he found, whereas just the one single bundle he can keep. And Rava explains, according to his line of reasoning, that the Baraisa is referring to bundles whose location is their distinguishing mark. If one finds bundles of grain in a public area, these belong to him due to the fact that they are kicked and they consequently roll to a different location than where they were placed. If he finds them in a secluded area, he is obligated to proclaim his find. Due to the absence of pedestrian traffic, they are not kicked and do not roll, and they therefore remain in the location where they were placed. And with regard to the sheaves, whether he finds them in a public area or whether he finds them in a secluded area, the finder takes them and proclaims his find. Since they are heavy, they do not roll when kicked. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll continue with page 23 tomorrow at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. A heads up that Sunday is Purim. So on Purim, we will go live on both these channels, Facebook and YouTube, at noon Pacific to do our annual reading in English of the Book of Esther, the Megillah. We'll read the whole Megillah. But what we will not do is have class at the regular time because we're going to be at a Purim Suda. So let me think about whether we're going to have class that day or not, and I'll announce it Saturday night. Either we'll have it at a different time, or we just won't have class that day on Purim. Let me think about that. I think we will have class, just probably at a different time. But we'll have the Megillah reading at noon. Okay. Okay, a couple of questions. Joe, a pickpocket causes unconscious despair, right? A pickpocket is like a thief, and then the person only realizes that they lost it, later. But as we see, the law is not like Rav; it's like Abaye. So, but that's it. But you know what? That's a different law. The pickpocket is like a thief. Now, what's interesting is the law that said that what a robber takes is taken, and what a robber gives is given. And what a thief takes is taken, what a thief gives is given. But then in that law, they define thief to be an armed bandit. So the pickpocket, who really is a thief, I don't think we know yet whether he's created, whether what he takes is considered taken, meaning that what and he gives it to someone else, they can keep it, or if you receive property, that might have been taken by a pickpocket from someone else, you have to proclaim it. Unclear. We haven't said that yet. I'm sorry. Nina's reminding me. Yeah, that a Saturday night we won't have class. That's right. So we'll have class tomorrow, Friday at noon. Saturday, that we usually do after Shabbos ends. This Saturday night we can't because we have to go back to shul and hear the Megillah, and that'll go late. And by the time we would get on the air, it'll be very late. So no class Saturday night. So that says to me even more, Sunday we will have class. I'm just not sure what time yet. Okay. Lucy. So the river sweeps a doghouse away from Reuven's house and it lands downstream on Shimon's land. Okay, good example. Reuven despaired of the recovery, but Shimon recognizes the doghouse as belonging to Reuven because it is a cute red doghouse and he admired it before. Does Shimon not have to return it to Reuven? I would say that he does have to return it. Right? This is a very clear distinguishing mark. And so even though what a river sweeps away is swept away, well, here, like if you knew that Reuven despaired, I guess technically you could keep it. But being a pious person and knowing who it belongs to, I think you gotta return it, and Reuven will be so happy to get it. But technically, if you kept it, and we know that Reuven despaired of it, then you would be entitled to keep it. But it's a great question. It's just the right kind of question. I think the answer is a pious person returns it. That if he doesn't return it, he can keep it because we know that Reuven despaired. Julie, whether we despair or not, should we not have a moral compass to give the belongings back, regardless if we have the right to keep them? Exactly what I was just talking about. Exactly. The moral compass says you return it and you should return it. And I'm sure the sages would agree. It's just if you didn't, could an action be brought against you? Probably not, but the moral compass should be far stronger. So, good point. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time.